Before you hear what happened, I want you to understand something about how I used to think about trust. I was the kind of man who left his door unlocked until he was 60, not because I was naive, because I'd lived long enough to believe that the people around you generally meant well, even when they didn't. That kind of thinking is comfortable. It fits you like an old coat, and you don't realize how much it's worn through until the cold gets in. My name is Gordon. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a water systems technician for the region of Peel, west of Toronto. Pipe networks, pressure valves, chlorination monitors. Work that keeps a city running without anyone knowing your name. I retired 14 months ago with a decent pension, a modest RRSP, and a house in Brampton that my wife Sandra and I bought in 1998 for less than what a parking spot costs downtown now. I'm not wealthy, but I'm comfortable, and it turns out that comfort to the right kind of person looks a lot like opportunity. What I'm about to tell you started with a smartwatch. My son Miles gave it to me 6 weeks after I retired. He drove up from Hamilton on a Sunday with his wife Tara and their youngest in the back seat. We had lunch. Sandra made roast chicken. Tara brought a cheesecake from a bakery in Ancaster. It was a good afternoon, the kind you forget to appreciate until later. After lunch, Miles set a small box on the table in front of me. A smartwatch. Black, sleek, nothing I would have picked for myself. "You're going to be walking a lot more now that you're retired," he said. "Track your steps. Monitor your heart rate. It's good for you, Dad." Tara smiled from across the table. "We synced it to your phone already. All you have to do is wear it." They'd synced it to my phone already. I didn't think anything of that at the time. I thanked them. I meant it. Retirement had been quieter than I expected, and the gesture felt like they were thinking about me. I wore the watch the next morning on my walk down by the Etobicoke Creek Trail. It tracked my steps. It buzzed when my heart rate climbed on the hill near Bavard. I called Sandra from the trail to tell her I'd done 4 kilometers. She laughed and said I sounded like a 12-year-old. Life went on. 6 weeks passed. Then something small happened that I couldn't explain. I was on the phone with my financial advisor, a man I'd been with for nearly a decade, sorting through where to move a chunk of my RRSP now that I was drawing it down. We spoke for about 40 minutes. I had the smartwatch on. I always had the smartwatch on by then. Habit forms fast when you're retired and your days need structure. 2 days later, Miles called. "Hey, Dad. Just checking in. How are things going with the RRSP stuff? You figured out where you're moving it?" I sat with the phone pressed to my ear for a moment longer than I should have before answering. "Fine," I said. "Still sorting it out." I almost let it go. Miles had always been curious about finances. He worked in project management, practical, organized. It could have been nothing. But I hadn't mentioned the RRSP conversation to anyone, not even Sandra. It had been a private call on a Tuesday afternoon when Sandra was at her sister's in Mississauga. I'm not the kind of man who jumps to conclusions. 31 years in water systems will do that to you. You don't panic when a pressure gauge spikes. You check the reading. You check it again. Then you act. I said nothing to Miles. I filed the feeling away the same way you note an odd vibration in a pump. Not an emergency, not yet, but something to watch. The following Monday, I was back at the Region of Peel offices, not for work but to drop off some retirement paperwork for HR. Hector was at the front desk, the same place he'd been for 22 years. Hector Adeyemi, old-school network infrastructure, the kind of man who remembered when we called them beepers. He'd been doing cybersecurity consulting on the side since the early 2010s and was sharper about technology than anyone I'd known at the region. He saw the watch. He asked about it. I said my son had given it to me. Hector's expression didn't change. Not exactly. But his eyes did. He asked me to take it off. Not as a joke. "Can I look at it for a second?" He turned it over, examined the back casing. Then he looked at me. "Gordon, do you know what app your son used to set this up?" I didn't. Of course I didn't. I'd handed him my phone when he asked. let him tap through it for a minute, and warn the watch the next morning. Hector set it gently on the desk between us. You should take this to the police before you go home tonight. I laughed, the same way you laugh when a doctor says something in a tone that doesn't match the words. It's a fitness tracker, Hector. He didn't smile. It was a fitness tracker. Bring it in. I drove to the Peel Regional Police Station on Ontario after dinner. The officer at the desk was professional, unhurried. A detective named Okafor came out 20 minutes later, late 40s, thorough, the kind of quiet that comes from seeing a lot and reacting to none of it. I handed him the watch and explained what Hector had said. He took it to a back room. When he returned, there was another man with him, younger, who said nothing and sat slightly to the side. Okafor placed the watch on the table the way a man places something he'd rather not touch. This device has been modified, he said. I asked him what that meant. The standard health monitoring features are functional, but there's additional software layered underneath. It's collecting audio, ambient sound, phone calls made in proximity, any conversation within a few meters. It's been pairing intermittently with a second device to push the data. My mouth went dry the way it does when you're standing in a mechanical room and you realize the sound you've been hearing isn't normal. Since when? I asked. Since it was set up. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of walking the trail, of talking to Sandra in the kitchen about the house, of calling my financial advisor about the RRSP, of muttering to myself in the garage about the fence that needed replacing before winter. 6 weeks of thinking I was alone when I wasn't. Okafor told me not to confront anyone, not to change my behavior, to act as though nothing had happened. I drove home through Brampton on a Tuesday evening in November. The highway was backed up past the 410 and I sat in traffic for 40 minutes with the radio off, thinking about the afternoon I'd spent teaching Miles to ride a bike in the driveway of our first house on Torbram Road. He must have been 7. He kept overcorrecting, then got it, suddenly and completely the way kids do. He didn't look back, he just rode. Sandra was watching television when I got home. I sat down beside her and watched whatever she was watching and said nothing. I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed about pipes. Not the work kind, the household kind, behind the walls, where you can't see them until they've already broken. The next morning I was calmer, not less afraid. Calmer, there's a difference. Fear is loud. What I had by morning was quiet and cold and steady, the kind of attention you pay to a system that's behaving wrong. At 9 I went for my regular walk. I wore the watch. I kept my voice normal when Sandra called out from the porch to ask if I wanted coffee when I got back. Sure, I said. 20 minutes. Then I stood at the edge of the creek path and said to no one, going to call about the fence quote today, also thinking about moving the rest of the GIC when it matures in February. Might just roll it into the TFSA. I said it the way I always talk to myself on walks, slightly too casual. Then I went home and drank my coffee and waited. Miles texted that evening, not immediately, around 9. Hey Dad, quick question. Is your GIC coming up soon? Was thinking of you earlier. Just curious where you're at with things. My hands were steady when I put the phone down. That steadiness surprised me. I think I'd been expecting to feel something sharper when the proof arrived. Instead, it was just a kind of settling, the way a reading levels off after it spikes. The numbers confirm what the sound already told you. I texted back, not for a while yet. Thanks for thinking of it. Then I called Okafor. He listened. When I finished, he let the silence sit for a moment. This is enough to escalate, he said. But I need you to keep going a little longer. Can you do that? I said I could. Tara and Miles came for dinner that weekend. Sandra made pasta. I poured wine. We talked about their youngest starting school in September, about the renovations they were considering in Hamilton, about nothing that mattered. I watched Tara more than I'd ever watched her before. She was warm, attentive, laughed at the right moments. She asked if I was eating well. She said I looked tired. She touched my arm when she said it. I said I'd been sleeping a bit funny since retirement. Adjustment, probably. She nodded like a woman who had expected that answer. After dinner, Miles helped me carry dishes to the kitchen. He said, "You know, Dad, if you ever need help with any of the paperwork stuff, banking, investments." Tara's actually pretty good at all that. She managed her mother's estate. She'd be happy to sit down with you. I rinsed a plate. Good to know, just saying. It can get overwhelming. I appreciate it. He squeezed my shoulder and went back to the living room. I stood at the sink for a moment, looking at the window above it. The yard was dark. My reflection looked back at me, indistinct. The following week, I went through the filing cabinet in the basement. It was something I'd been meaning to do since retirement: old tax returns, insurance binders, appliance manuals for things we no longer owned. I went through it methodically, the way I'd been trained to do inspections. One folder at a time. Near the back, behind a manila envelope of RESP documents from when Miles was in school, I found something that didn't belong. A slim folder, newer than the rest. Clean edges, fresh paper. Inside were printed documents. Not official, not signed. Templates. The language was formal and careful. Capacity assessment referral. A printed article from the Ontario government website about substitute decision-making, with passages highlighted in yellow. In the margin of one page, handwritten in small, neat letters. GP forgets dates, appointments. Get documented. Push for assessment before spring. GP. My initials. I sat on the basement floor with the folder in my lap for a long time. The furnace kicked on. Sandra called down to ask if I wanted tea. I said not yet. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't financial opportunism. This was a plan. Someone was building a case, a paper trail that would let them step in and take over my decisions. Medical decisions. Financial decisions. Everything. Not by stealing. By making me disappear on paper. I thought about Tara's mother's estate. About how Tara had managed it. About what that experience must have taught her. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it. Upstairs, I told Sandra I'd found the basement in decent shape. She seemed pleased. The next morning, I called a lawyer I'd used when we refinanced the house. I asked him about power of attorney in Ontario, specifically what it would take for someone to petition for guardianship over a person who hadn't consented. He walked me through it carefully. He said the threshold was higher than most people assumed, but that a pattern of documented memory or judgment issues, combined with a willing applicant, could open the door. He also said the process could move quickly once it started. I thanked him and called Okafor. "There's a folder," I said, "in my basement. It has handwritten notes about me, dates, the word assessment," a pause on the line. "Don't remove it. I know, Gordon, you need to understand something. The watch is one thing. Surveillance is serious. But guardianship fraud, attempting to assume control of a person who has full capacity, that's a different category. If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just a family dispute." I stood in my kitchen with my coat still on. Outside, the November sky was the color of old concrete. A neighbor was scraping ice off his car in the driveway. Normal Tuesday. "What do I do?" I asked. "Keep feeding them the line, carefully, and forward me everything." I wore the watch through December. I said things into the empty kitchen about memory lapses, about having trouble with dates, about needing to write everything down now. I mentioned more than once, to no one, that I was thinking about asking Miles and Tara to help manage things. Each time, within a day or two, Tara would text, checking in, offering, suggesting we sit down together in the new year to get things organized. Once she texted after I'd mentioned the car registration, "Dad, just a reminder. Miles said you sometimes forget the little administrative stuff. Happy to help you set up automatic reminders on your phone." I'd never forgotten the car registration in my life. Sandra noticed Tara's attention and found it touching. "She's really stepped up since you retired," she told me one night. "She cares about you." "I know," I said. What I didn't tell Sandra, what I couldn't tell her yet, was that I'd found something else. Not in the folder. In my email. I had a habit of leaving my email open on the laptop in the kitchen. I knew Sandra occasionally used the laptop. I'd never thought anything of it. But when I checked my sent folder one afternoon, after noticing the laptop had been moved slightly on the counter, I found something that had been forwarded 2 weeks earlier. My financial advisor's summary email, the one he'd sent after our October call. The one that listed the approximate value of the RRSP, the GIC, the TFSA. Forwarded to an address I didn't recognize. I photographed the screen with my phone and called Okafor that night from the car parked in the driveway with the engine running. He told me that was what he'd been waiting for. The meeting was set for the second week of January. Not at my house, not at theirs. At the branch of my bank on Queen Street West in Brampton, at the request of their fraud department. Okafor had been in contact with a woman named Lynn Charbonneau, an investigator in the bank's financial crimes unit. I'd spoken to her once on the phone. She had the voice of someone who had sat across from a lot of people who thought they were smarter than they were. Miles and Tara didn't know what the meeting was about. Miles texted the night before to say he was glad we were finally getting the financial stuff sorted. Tara said she'd bring her folder. She brought her folder. I arrived first. The boardroom was small, the kind of room banks use for things they don't want in the main lobby. Lynn Charbonneau was already seated. Okafor came in behind me and took a chair near the wall. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table and sat down across from where Miles and Tara would sit. They arrived together, Tara in a blazer, Miles in his good coat, the charcoal one he wore to job interviews. They stopped when they saw Okafor. Miles looked at me. "Dad, what is this?" "Sit down," I said. Lynn opened the meeting without drama. She introduced herself, explained the bank's fraud investigation protocols, and then set a printed document on the table facing Tara. "Miss Tara," she said, "you've been in contact with this branch on 3 separate occasions over the past 2 months, representing yourself as having or anticipating financial authority over Mr. Gordon's accounts. Is that correct?" Tara looked at Miles. "I was gathering information on his behalf. Did Mr. Gordon ask you to do that?" A pause. "We discussed it. He has no record of authorizing any contact." Lynn turned a page. "You also accessed and forwarded account size information from his email without his knowledge. We have the timestamps." Miles turned to look at Tara. Something crossed his face that I'd never seen there before. Lynn set another document down. The folder. Photographs of every page, including the margins. "These notes," she said. "Are these yours?" Tara's jaw tightened. "I was trying to be proactive. Gordon's been showing signs." "What signs?" I said. First time I'd spoken since they sat down. She looked at me. "You forget things, Gordon. You've said so yourself." "I've set it into a watch you modified to record me. I kept my voice level. And then you wrote it down in a folder in my basement and highlighted government websites about how to remove someone's right to make their own decisions." The room was very quiet. Miles said, "Tara." She didn't answer him. Okafor leaned forward. "The device you provided Mr. Gordon was altered to capture ambient audio and transmit location data to a paired device registered to you. The forwarded email containing financial summaries was sent from his account to an address linked to you. Combined with the documentation found in the family home, this constitutes a pattern that we're treating as attempted financial exploitation of an older adult under the Ontario elder abuse laws." Miles looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found something unrecognizable. "I didn't know," he said. "To me, not to anyone else." I believed him. That was the part that made it harder, not easier. Tara said nothing. Her hands were flat on the folder. She was still. The kind of still that isn't calm. Lynn pressed a button on a small recorder. My voice filled the room. Steady, clear. Me. Talking to myself in the kitchen 3 weeks earlier about the GIC and the TFSA. Then Tara's text. Timestamped 14 hours later. Then the forwarded email opened and sent while I was supposedly at the grocery store. Okafor looked at Tara. "You'll need to come with me." She stood. She looked at Miles. Then she looked at me. "I was protecting him," she said. You're all going to be thanking me in 5 years." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that the room hadn't already said. Miles walked out after. He didn't look back, which was the right instinct, even if for the wrong reasons. I sat there for another minute after everyone else had moved. Lynn gathered her papers. Okafor spoke quietly to another officer near the door. I looked at the glass of water I hadn't touched and thought about all the conversations I'd had in my own kitchen, in my own house, while my wrist quietly sent them somewhere else. Outside, the January air was sharp enough to make your eyes water. I stood in the bank's parking lot on Queen Street and watched a city bus pull in and out of the stop across the road. A woman in a red coat walked a dog that didn't want to walk. 2 teenagers leaned against the bus shelter, not talking, just existing. I had thought, driving over that morning, that once it was over I would feel relief, or anger, or something clearly defined. What I felt instead was tired, and old and very awake. Miles called me that night from a hotel in Brampton. He said he didn't know. He said it in 3 different ways. I said I believed him, because I did, and because saying otherwise wouldn't have helped either of us. We talked for almost an hour. Not about Tara, not about the investigation, not about what came next. We talked about the house on Torbram Road, about his grandmother's kitchen, about things that existed before any of this and would exist after. He cried once, quietly, and then stopped. I didn't say anything when it happened. I just let it be there. In February, I met with my lawyer and updated my power of attorney. I designated 2 people, a friend from the region and my sister in Guelph, who had nothing to gain. I changed every password. I opened new accounts. I moved what needed moving. I went back to wearing a regular watch. The one Sandra had given me for our 25th anniversary, a simple Seiko with a white face and a leather strap that had cracked along the edge and been repaired so many times it had a scar. Mechanical, no Bluetooth, no GPS, no software underneath. It loses about 2 minutes a month. I find that reassuring. Hector bought me a coffee when I stopped by the region to tell him how it had ended. He stirred his cup and didn't say "I told you so," which is the most generous thing a person can do. Sandra and I still haven't talked about all of it. We've talked around the edges, the way you do when something has entered a marriage and you're both still deciding what shape it left. She apologized once for not seeing it. I told her I hadn't seen it either, and that was true, and somehow that helped. What I know now at 63, that I didn't know 6 weeks into retirement, is this. The things that are worth taking from you will never be taken loudly. No one breaks down your door to steal your agency. They give you a gift. They offer to help. They let you get used to them being close, and then one day you look up and the space between you and your own decisions has become very, very small. I used to leave my door unlocked because I believed the people around me meant well. I still believe most of them do. But meaning well and acting well are not the same thing, and a door without a lock is still an open door. Pay attention to the gifts you didn't ask for. Ask questions the giver doesn't expect. Write things down, not because your memory is failing, but because paper is honest in ways that people sometimes aren't. Your name, your money, your right to speak for yourself. These things don't announce when they're in danger. They just quietly begin to disappear. And by the time you notice, you've already been wearing the watch for 6 weeks.